Welcome to the Purple Collective podcast. It's our first episode as the Purple Collective podcast. We've got some ideas of structure and features that we've been chatting about before, but the main thing you need to know today is we're talking about accessible tourism and joined by Chris Fry, who we both been chatting about doing a bit of a podcast format that obviously a lot of my background is around the sort of brand marketing side. And Chris, as we'll come to in a second, has very much been working in the world of legal and rights. So they're quite complementary, holistic fields. And then today we're joined by Ross Calladine because of the topic of accessible tourism. So I'll throw to Chris. Care to share whatever you want to set up from your side? And then we'll throw to Ross afterwards as well.
Yeah, well, it's really good to be involved with this. Obviously, it's a practical subject that matters to lots of people. One of the few joys we have at the moment is thinking about holidays, or whether they're UK based or abroad, and it's become an increasingly large part of my current practice. Lots of giving lots of advice about things, answering lots of questions. So I was really as an Equality Act lawyer that focuses really on disability and what's okay and what isn't in terms of expectations and what you can do about it. I thought this is a great opportunity to sort of have a conversation about it with you, and clearly to have Ross here giving his his analysis of current situations, what he's doing, working on through his work with the government and through your work, Ross, is really interesting. So it's great to have a forum where we can have a conversation about this from my perspective, where it's not in a confrontational courtroom situation. So hopefully
Well,
people
let's
listening
see.
will benefit.
Let's see, Chris. Great. And yeah, over to you, Ross.
Yeah, great. Thanks for inviting me on the call today, Martin. It's great that it's the first under the Purple Collective banner. Really delighted to be alongside you, Chris, as well. I've heard so much about your great work in this space over the years. So absolute pleasure to be with you today. So I work for the National Tourism Agency, and we go by the name of Visit England and Visit Britain. So we're all about growing the visitor economy. So we want to see more people travelling, whether that's for holidays within Britain or coming from abroad to visit Britain and England, and on business trips as well. So I've been with the organisation for coming up 17 years and developed a specialism in accessible tourism and become a bit of a kind of a super advocate, an ally to the disabled traveller community. Really trying to push our industry along. There's lots of barriers, and we're trying to break down those barriers and bring the industry along with us. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation today.
Well, you touched on one of those sentiments that you both know I'm passionate about when you mentioned growing the economy. And that might be a funny thing to say from a disability inclusion advocate. But I think over my probably a couple of decades now of working in this space, it's that sort of realization that as long as we're in this world where there is that part of the world that businesses are set up to make profit. We got a guest appearance in the back there, Chris.
I know.
Who's that?
It's stealing my thunder, actually. We've got a team mascot. It should be a goat. It's a cat.
Yeah, the day there's a goat in my living room, we've got bigger problems. But
Beyond brand, very good.
I mean, this makes
yeah,
me look.
the sentiment I was moving to was that when we start with disability inclusion, we get the barriers and the social model, which we can touch upon where necessary. But for me, it's been how to engage in any industry the brands that provides the goods and the services to be more inclusive and more accessible. And so there's that part of it where there's the business case, and then there's sometimes, as we know, in particular areas, there are bits where the business case isn't always understood or believed or maybe quite adds up as the brand would like. And so there's other ways to try and move inclusion forward. But I mean, for you, Ross, just for that business case, how have you seen that evolve the last few years across different parts of tourism?
Yeah, I mean, we try and lead with that carrot. We try and dangle that business case carrot. And when I first started managing this work program, the business case for accessible tourism wasn't really very formed. So what we realized is we needed a bit more data. So we put a question to ask whether you or any of your traveling companions have any health conditions or impairments. We put that question into our main tourism surveys. So that's for people taking day trips in England or maybe staycations, those domestic overnight trips. But also we put it into the inbound survey, the international passenger survey. And what that allowed us to do is quantify the size of the market. And currently it's estimated to be around £14.6 billion. So that's how much anyone travelling to and within England specifically has spent with their travelling party. But we know that it could be a lot bigger because there's another survey that says that 50% of disabled people haven't taken an overnight holiday trip in England in the last 12 months, and that compares to 35% of non-disabled people. So yeah, it's a big market. Our stats tell us that the tourism purple pound is huge, but it actually could be a lot bigger. We just need to break more of those barriers down.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I mean, Chris, I guess go where you feel your day in day out working around Equalities Act. I suppose what when you look at tourism, what have you seen in recent years that speak to where there, I guess, is like a breach of rights of disabled people as customers, and just give us a little bit more of a flavour around that part of the inclusion puzzle.
I mean, those stats. I mean, it's fantastic that you've got those stats first and foremost, but and you're asking the questions to about well, fundamentally the question I had arising from that is whether there's a sub question to the 50% stat that asks why. Do you know if it's because people are finding it more expensive, or because they can't find? Is it because the accessible accommodation or transport, for example, doesn't exist, or is it because of the cost, or are those two things connected? I wonder. Because I often see that.
Yeah, you've touched on some key reasons there. It does dig into a little bit of it, but there are other surveys that are uncovering some of the main barriers. Now, cost is one of the main ones that comes up.
Yeah.
But also the ones that we're particularly interested in is the barriers related to what businesses can influence themselves, the actual offer they provide, but also what comes up a lot is the information. And that's why Visit England, lead projects to try and improve the holiday planning experience for people traveling in England and to England, because information just empowers people, right? And the opposite happens if you don't provide good quality, detailed access information, you disempower people. So we spend a lot of our efforts trying to improve the provision of quality, detailed accessibility information for places to stay and places to visit. And I feel we've been on that journey for a long, long time, and we've still got so much more to achieve. We're in it for the long game. We need to keep banging the drum that this information is sought after. It enables people to take trips they otherwise wouldn't have taken.
Yeah, I agree. I think obviously when we're looking at this podcast and the audience, I'm sure there's going to be different people, and obviously we try and put people in categories like there are disabled people looking to travel, and there are disabled people working in the industry, and there's other variables of people that may be watching and listening to this. But I think the values of the collective is about how that voice of the people that care about disability inclusion can make a difference. And I think it's also about empowering people, as you just said, Ross, with the right information. So just Ross, from the work you've been doing and some things that you're aware of in other places, what resources are out there that are good and helpful, even if the whole industry is not yet accessible? But I totally agree that information and knowledge is power, as they say. So yeah, kind of what resources could we signpost some people to that maybe are looking to take a first trip or a more adventurous trip, but just struggling a little bit at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So obviously my remit is kind of domestic and inbound travel to England and Britain. So the Visit Britain website has an accessible Britain guide, which we've worked with the team on recently to create. And that's aimed at international visitors coming over to Britain. And it spotlights some of our most accessible product, places to visit, places to stay from the different regions and nations of Britain. So we put some work into that. And then we're just about to relaunch the Visit England consumer website later in March. And we're redoing our showcase of accessible places to stay and visit within England. So, this is the inspirational content that really just uncovers some of those hidden gems, and letting more people know that, because there is a wealth of accessible things to do and to see, but sometimes they're hard to find, and we want to try and uncover some of those. So yeah, later in March, visitengland.com will have a new website with new ideas for accessible travel.
Great. And I mean, I suppose again to that collective voice, and I asked this question in the sort of positive engagement and relationship building meaning of the question of what do brands need to hear from disabled people? Like what, I think we know that because the world's still not been designed and built accessibly, there is understandably a lot of frustration from disabled people about the barriers and the things that aren't yet where they should be, and we get that. That's like fair enough. But in building bridges, how could the disabled community allies proactively empower tourism brands to be more inclusive?
Yeah, and I think operators need to understand where that frustration comes from. It comes from a place of having to tackle discrimination and endure barriers every single day. So I think what we need to do is address the disconnect that's often in place between tourism operators and the disabled community, and bring the two closer together, because it shouldn't be an us and a them. Like, all of us can think about friends, family members that are disabled or have different access requirements. And I think we just need to bring it a bit closer to home and build those great partnerships, because great things happen when you bring together like disabled persons organizations with their local tourism body, their DMO, their destination management organization. So that's where I see really good things happen, when actually the conversation is really constructive. And I know that there's loads of different groups around the country of people with lived experience of disability just really wanting to share that experience with the tourism industry to help them to improve their offer. And when that happens, it's great. It improves it for everyone.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ross. I mean, Chris, obviously, any reflections you've had so far?
Yeah,
Go for it.
you'll have seen me scribbling away as we were going there,
I
and
did.
and
Ferociously.
yeah, so that
Should I be worried?
no, not at all. So the so I was thinking about the the nudging and the work you have to do to encourage businesses to become more accessible. And one of the thoughts I had was that it is often there's a focus on the room itself or the hotel itself or the accommodation being accessible, but you mentioned destination management as being sort of an important function. So often it is about looking at more than just the accommodation, isn't it? It's about if you're promoting if you're promoting a place, as I guess you do, how you can, what does Visit England do to help with that promotion and help nudge various other partners into making sure that the area itself and the tourist attractions around them are accessible, as well as just sort of promoting any particular venue? Because I guess you can't, as an organisation, promote any venues, can you? Or can you?
We spotlight. We don't have definitive listings, but we spotlight on top tens and different thematic kind of collections. So we do that. But to answer your question, you're absolutely right. There's a whole what we call the tourism value chain, and
Right.
it all needs to be accessible for it to work when someone with access requirements is taking a holiday. So getting to the destination, the accommodation, getting around the destination, the places to visit, whether that be indoor or outdoor attractions and experiences, and then obviously the travel back home. So our work with destinations, and we're now working with an accredited collection of destinations around England that are called local visitor economy partnerships. So that nice, nice,
Not an easy
catchy
abbreviation, is it? Yeah.
No, well, the acronym is an LVEP. Yeah. So we're working now with around 38 or so LVEPs to take them through a training program on how to really engender a more accessible destination. And we just started that program yesterday. So we are working with Access and Inclusion UK, who are experts in working on accessible tourism, and they're going to be supporting and mentoring a representative from each of these destinations. So helping them to understand the value of working with other stakeholders across the destination. It's not just accommodation, it's not just attractions, it's the public realm as well. It's the transport operators into and around the destination. So it can become quite complex. There are lots of parts of the jigsaw, but everyone needs to work together with that clear aim to improve it for not just the visitor, but if you improve the access for the visitor, you improve it for the local community as well.
Yeah, and visitors' families as well. But so, I mean, how do you have you found it easy to incentivize? So I'm using legal language, service providers, but venues, for example. How have you found it easy to sort of make the case that it might cost a bit more to do something to make some, widen a space or put a ramp in or whatever, but actually in the end it's better business? I mean, are there examples? How do you champion the businesses that are doing it really, really well?
Yeah, it really is. From an engagement perspective, it's hearts and minds. And actually, I know that there is the stick of the legislation of the Equality Act, but what we hear is it's usually that businesses are doing it because they recognise it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Often, the businesses that are doing it particularly well have someone senior, whether that's the business owner, the chief exec, or someone that has lived experience of disability, either themselves personally or someone close in their family and friends network. But then they do recognize the business case. So they're not saying they're doing it because it's legal or because there's a business case. They're more often saying we're doing it because it's the right thing. We know we need to be improving our offer, but then we appreciate that there are also these other imperatives around legal obligations as well. What was your follow-on part to that, Chris? Sorry, because that was the first part of your question.
Well, it was about how you champion businesses that are really doing a
Yes.
great job to incentivize
Yeah.
others or give a business case to show that it's actually good for everyone.
Yeah, so we really encourage destinations to showcase accessible tourism businesses. And one way we do that is that within the Visit England Awards for Excellence, which are like the highest accolade of English tourism, they're an annual tourism awards. We've got the accessible and inclusive tourism category. Um, and most of our feeder competitions, our local competitions, run that category, not all of them. And that gives us sight of some of the really best practice that's out there in the tourism industry. And we shout about those winners every year. Last year it was Hoe Grange Holidays that won gold. They've been leaders in this market for many years. It's not the first time they've won that award, but there's also attractions, there's smaller, kind of community run initiatives like Fleetwood Beach Wheelchairs. Every type of tourism business can get recognition on the Accessible and Inclusive Tourism Award. And it's kind of a project that I love working on the most, because I love getting to know those businesses and the great work that they're doing, the experiences that they're delivering for disabled travellers.
Yeah, well, that's really fascinating because my follow-on question, sorry, Martin, you've probably got your own questions, but my follow-on question was whether the best examples or whether there's a difference in what you see between venues which are internationally owned businesses or locally owned businesses.
Good question. Yeah,
I
feel
got to be very careful about that, I guess.
No, not really. I just feel that it's sometimes it's ironically it's easier for the smaller businesses. Now, people often think it's the other way around. They often think it's easier for the bigger business because they've got massive turnovers, right? They've got all the money, they've got all the resource. But what that brings is layers of sign off. But if you go into an owner operated business, like a self catering operator, like Cottage in the Dales, for example, and you get them to understand the value of this market and the importance of doing it, they can hop onto that and they don't have to go through multiple layers of sign off. They're the owners of the business. So they are making the decisions and they're making things happen. And once they decide we're going to do accessibility, they get on and do it. And there's so many great accessible self-catering properties across England. You just go onto something like Accessible Holiday Escapes and you'll find loads of great accessible accommodation. I think there's fewer examples to point to with some of the like multinational hoteliers, for example. There's pockets of good activity, but they're global. They're trying to, in America, listen to the ADA and do what's quite prescriptive over there. Whereas in the UK, the Equality Act isn't as prescriptive. It's based on what's reasonable. And I'm interested in putting a question back to you on that, Chris, because people ask me about my views on it.
Is that allowed?
It would be good just to get your take on how you think the Equality Act works or doesn't work. Because for me, I feel that I understand why it's based on reasonableness, and that is recognizing the different shapes and sizes and budgets of businesses, and it should have that flexibility. But equally, it's led to Visit England feeling like there's a gap in practical guidance that we've then gone on to fill with our toolkit for businesses, because looking within the materials of the Equality Act, it doesn't really give enough guidance for hospitality and tourism businesses on what good looks like. So we've done that piece of work ourselves, working with people across the industry and the disabled community.
So I think the Equality Act gives a really good framework for people to enforce, for individuals to enforce their rights, and for those sometimes to involve bringing regulators or local authorities, into account as well. But the main problem with it is it um, it relies upon something having gone wrong before you can really do anything about it. By which stage the whole thing is broken. Venues will have had bad reviews, which doesn't work for them either. People have lost a lot of money in this sort of situation, and they'll have had a bad experience. It is possible for, so I think it's not ideal in that respect, although it is, it's better. I mean, it is possible for people to get injunctions to require somewhere to be made accessible once they've booked. So whilst I've been involved in cases which have done that in terms of going to events, for example, I've yet to be instructed to look at obtaining an injunction for a venue that says, well, actually now we've decided, since you've told us you've got an assistance animal, for example, we're cancelling your booking, for example. Then in those circumstances, it might be possible for people to claim against that. But overall, the problem is that whilst the Equality Act gives people rights and can cause a fair amount of damage, reputationally and in terms of costs and compensation, not many people really tend to take up those actions because really it's an imbalanced relationship. You're paying for something, you don't want to go and have a bad experience, and the irony is, I bet hardly any service provider, any venue wants to provide a bad experience either.
Right.
So the Equality Act can do some stuff, but I don't think in this situation, bringing the big stick out isn't going to really help. I think the work that you're doing, and finding a mechanism to find an alternative means of resolution is probably a better option. So I hope I've not dodged that question.
And Chris, am I right in saying that there isn't much case law when it comes to the Equality Act for provision of goods and services? There is more case law maybe on the employment side, but people ask me this over the years, and I get the impression that a lot of stuff is settled kind of behind the scenes, out of court. And what that means is that organisations and kind of champions for accessibility in industries such as myself, we don't really have that case law to point to.
You're absolutely right. There's very little case law. What there is often at county court level, which is not very, it's sort of useful but not binding unless it gets up to the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court. I think there's only one case went to the county court, and that was about an accessible or an inaccessible tourist venue.
Right.
But no, I mean, most cases, and sensibly, do settle by mediation, which is subject to a confidentiality clause. But also, so it's unhelpful for the general peace because you can't waive anything at people and say you're going to be bound by this. But on the other hand, the benefit to that is that it allows an opportunity for people to build bridges and restore relationships. Because I've really very rarely met or come across any business that is intentionally set out to create a bad experience or to discriminate against people. It's just generally a lack of understanding or thinking it through or listening to customers. Yeah. So building relationships in a mediated settlement means that you're going to get repeat custom, which is great. So but you're absolutely right. No, there aren't really many cases to point to as precedents, but potentially quite a few successes for alternative resolutions.
So something I thought was good timing to mention hoisting hotels, which I think speaks to quite a lot of certainly the last few bits we've both been chatting to. It's been one of the campaigns that the Purple Collective has been championing. It kind of spawned a bit out of the Purple Collective and my direct experiences. And to what you were saying, Ross, it's whereby myself and many other disabled people with similar requirements to those that I have, it's that larger hotel brand where, as you say, the smaller self-catered, there's more options and things to go for. But trying to get an accessible room with a big hotel that has a hoist is nigh on impossible. So Ross and I, we've been chatting quite a lot about, why that might be and where there might be ways to sort of try to move it forward positively, basically. But from that brand Purple Goat sort of marketing economic side, my attempts to speak to the big brands has fallen a bit on deaf ears thus far, to say the least. Um, and then Chris, we've bounced what would that look like if there was a way to use the stick. But as you've just said already, and the general sort of point is, it's like hopefully no one's setting out to make life bad for disabled people. It is about mediation and building bridges and coming to kind of win-win conclusions. But I just thought, I wanted to mention hoisting hotels because it's something we've all been aware of and talking about with the Purple Collective. But it does feel like quite a tangible, specific example of the broader general points we've been making so far. Ross, don't feel you have to say loads more on this. As in, like, I think I've covered the what is it, and we're kind of trying to figure out. But is there anything you want to add to that? And then I'd love to hear from you, Chris, a little bit around some of what you just said before with the Equalities Act, but that specific provision about hoisting hotels for disabled people. But just, Ross, anything you want to add first?
Yeah, the lack of hoists in hotels is, really a problem for people that rely on that equipment and that feature. I think we look towards the Changing Places campaign and we look at how for many, many years that was not really getting traction. And then by sticking at it and, really having a whole host of people that got behind that campaign and just kept telling the people's stories, the impact of not having that level of toilet facility and, the reality of people having to get changed on the floor, people having urinary infections, you just, all awful things really. So I think we have to tell the people stories. I think we have to really look at addressing some of the misconceptions or the fears that the hotelier might have around it. Or if I put this equipment into my bedrooms, then that's going to maybe lower occupancy because maybe seeing that medical looking equipment is not going to be attractive for people to stay in that room. Actually, we know the opposite can be true, right? So Martin and I know about a great initiative, a hotel. It was Hotel Brooklyn in Manchester. It's now been rebranded as a Voco Hotel. And they created what were called Liberty Rooms, right? And the idea is that these rooms were inclusive for everyone rather than just exclusive for disabled people. So actually, those rooms drove the highest occupancy of any room type within the hotel. And within the first year of operation, that hotel generated an extra 200 and odd thousand pounds, not just because of those rooms, but because of their event space as well that they had made accessible. So they were winning event business. Now, Martin, we know that it's not perfect. The tracked hoist doesn't go through to the bathroom. That's a problem. But the way that they've actually thought about the look and feel and the actual tracking for the hoist system doubles up as a lighting feature.
Yeah.
And the hoist goes within an attractive bed surround cupboard unit. It's there when anyone needs it, but you wouldn't know, and it doesn't detract from the look and feel of the room if you don't need it. So there are examples, there are ways and means of doing things. I think it needs to be part of a broader buy-in on accessibility. I don't think that you can go to a hotel and lead with the hoist and say, right, you've not got a hoist. We need to get a hoist into your hotel. There has to be a development of that hotel's accessibility maturity, right? They need to get it from all angles. They need to understand the customer service, the training of the staff, the information, because there's no point in having a hoist if you don't tell anyone in your
That's
marketing.
the big one, isn't it?
You have
It's,
a
it's like the local restaurant, and this is like more of a general storytelling than an actual restaurant, but it's like the restaurant that says, we bought a ramp and no one in a wheelchair came and used the ramp. And you're like, did you tell anyone locally that you'd got a ramp for your restaurant? So, yeah, I fully agree with that point, Ross.
But promotion needs
Yeah.
you need confidence to be able to promote something.
Yeah.
And I truly believe the reason why lots of hotels and other tourism businesses are maybe not, well, we call it purple hushing, so it's the opposite to greenwashing. So greenwashing is where you're overstating your sustainability credentials. And I don't take credit for this. I picked it up from someone else, but I love it. Purple hushing, people are playing down and hiding information about their accessibility because they're worried that it might not be good enough for everyone. So rather than communicate what they feel might be substandard facilities, they don't say anything about the facilities, and that's actually worse. And I think we need to give businesses confidence, confidence to talk about the features, talk about the facilities, and understand why that's so important.
Yeah, thank you, Ross. So yeah, I mean, and Chris, it's I think I framed it already for you, but it'd just be good to hear if we've had a couple of chats about like, is there a place for the law? But really, it's back to how do we empower the audience listening to understand rights, but lead toward that, building bridges and that sort of win-win result.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. But really interested in, I totally agree with Ross. But the purple hushing stuff is really fascinating, and I was just wondering why people don't do that. Actually, before I come on to that, because is it thinking about the cases I run typically, it's often down to people not. It's often down to human contact, people, staff who are often sort of, and this is in larger venues typically rather than the smaller venues, where they have a higher staff turnover, potentially don't, maybe they're not so certain that, or if they advertise the space is accessible, but then it's made inaccessible by a lack of disability aware staff, for example. Maybe there's a wider issue there about sort of the software as well as the hardware, if you like. So that's something to maybe think about as well. Maybe it's a lack of confidence in the team, which is a wider point, and is equally part of accessible tourism and venues, isn't it? Really. But yeah, I think I'd echo the point you made that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, changing places stuff was very, very difficult, and they've come on absolutely. I mean, their brand is great, the coverage is fantastic. It was a mixture of great campaigning, great from probably bodies like yours, Ross, but also different campaign groups, and also a mixture the strategic litigation as well. Which always comes down to an individual bringing a case, highlighting how terrible it is, and once you get people talking about that case, and there's a threat of litigation, then suddenly all the businesses and their unions and representatives look at it and think, whoa, this is going to cost us a fortune if we don't get it right, and we're vulnerable to litigation. So strategic litigation is good, and I can see that when it comes to hoist might be something that happens in the fullness of time, especially given, because I didn't know until you told me that that you can have, there are adjustments that can be made to the tracks, which mean that you can swap them out, so it doesn't affect, not that it should matter really, but the customer experience of non-disabled, non-hoist using customers. So that's important. But I think one of the obvious problems is the building regs side of things and compliance, because venues often think, well, we're not required to have one. Or there are certain British standards or codes of practice, British standards, and relating to designs of accessible and inclusive built environments, which only sort of require a percentage of rooms to have hoists, and maybe that's only on new builds. But I wonder if more can be done in terms of looking at designing hoists into new builds and looking at planning applications. So an individual likely to be affected by a new application could, under with existing legal rights, challenge the planning application. Say you have to have due regard to, or at least the local authority giving the planning or making the planning decision should have due regard to accessibility and inclusion when looking at whether to grant permission for a new build space or a rebranded. So I know, Ross, you probably know more about the built environment work than I do, but if a building is being reclassified, for example, then that, I think, leads to a reassessment of criteria. So I think there's more to be done in terms of looking at the Equality Act in terms of designing accessibility and hoists into new builds, and potentially, interestingly, given the earlier conversation about different sized venues, I think there's less excuse for a large multinational or internationally owned venue. There's less excuse for them not to have one than there is for the smaller venue on this side of the northeast coast, for example, because it comes down to the reasonable cost associated with that. And it's never going to be reasonable if it's going to put a business out of business. That's not helpful to anybody. But if you're a large organization, then you should be looking at doing that as a matter of course.
Yeah, no, and I don't disagree with you on that point at all, Chris. Just taking it back, you were saying first and foremost about training and the actual customer-facing staff. And for many years, we've spoke about what we call the three pillars of accessible tourism, and there's actually a fourth. But the three being the built environment, which is what often people think about first and foremost. But then the welcome and the customer service, which you've mentioned, and then the information. And if you employ people, the fourth one is employment. And really, to be an accessible provider, an accessible business, you need to have addressed all of those areas. There's no good having any one of them in isolation. If you've got a hoist, but you don't communicate it, or your staff don't know how to use it, well, it's not going to work.
It'd be a bit like having a swimming pool, but not having a anyone to police it. I can't remember what the name is now for the
lifeguard.
That's it.
Cool. I'm mindful of the time, gentlemen. I think really where you brought us to there, Chris, it's probably fair to say is where my year or so of personal research and exploration and some chats with Ross, some chats with Chris, and chats with other people has got us to. I think that it's that change in place. I don't want to say blueprint, but inspired by change in places, and definitely something about the Part M building reg planning. Like that's not something that we can then just have sorted and done and dusted tomorrow, unfortunately. But I think that's probably where the proper change comes from. So I think we'll keep going on what that looks like at the Purple Collective and engage the collective voices to help once there's more clarity around where the right levers are and which levers we need to pull. The final feature today is a sort of Q&A, Chris, where going forward, we're going to probably have some live streams so people could ask on a live stream. And obviously, even on a recording like this, put a call out now. If you've got any questions on right type sentiments, send them in to us on our Instagram and through the website. So there'll be a feature that we do every time. I think we've covered a lot today around accessible tourism, but is there one or two sort of Q&A type things, Chris, you wanted to finish us off with on the tourism sentiment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of reflecting on what I've got myself into. It just sounds like I'm going to be put under loads of pressure every
That's
episode.
basically it. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
great, brilliant. But I think the main thing today is that there was news, at least in my area up in Yorkshire, about a Paralympian who's booked onto a cruise, or a former Paralympian who's booked onto a cruise which turned out to be very inaccessible, both in terms of um, the room and also not able to do trips out. So this was abroad, so you can breathe out, Ross, in that. But it highlights a big issue, obviously, and I know, Martin, you're regularly involved in it through the rights on flight side of things again, which is as people are, looking at the Montreal. It's the Montreal Convention point. So I've been asked to look at that again today, and it's probably helpful just to sort of clarify a question or to give an answer to a question I was asked earlier about it, which is that essentially the rights that apply in terms of air and sea travel in the UK are really limited to sort of when you get on the gate, when you get through the gate. So you have rights to get through the gate. But not very much after that. So the Montreal Convention basically is an international treaty which limits everybody's rights in the air. And there was a really important case on that. It's not very often I quote cases, but for those of you with an interest in it, it's Stott, STOTT, and Thomas Cook, which is a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court slammed Thomas Cook in relation to the service it gave to a disabled passenger on a flight. And it was backed by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. But essentially, none of us really at the moment, because the UK signed up to an international treaty on it, have a right to enforce various obligations, even against UK sort of providers that one would normally expect to be able to enforce, which is pretty unsatisfactory. And so the answer in relation to the Paralympian case I just mentioned was that really there's one option to challenge, and it's if you book through if you've disclosed a disability and you've booked it through a package holiday from a UK-based provider. But apart from that, there's very little that can be done, which is more a campaigning point at the moment. In terms, I know that there's the campaign on the assisted air travel stuff that you're involved with, and Sophie Morgan is. Arguably, the Civil Aviation Authority in those situations could be empowered to do more in terms of also the design and build of ships and planes, because there's very little, interestingly. There's another case that I was asked to look at, or I was discussing with a friend today, where they bought a first class ticket on a flight, non-ambulant wheelchair using customer, and first class actually is not accessible because they've reduced the size of the width of the aisles so that a wheelchair user can't do it, which means essentially some vehicles are being designed, or some disabled people are being designed out of access on buildings. And so there's quite a lot to look at there on a wider issue. But as I say, in terms of that, I think that's mainly a lobbying point. But the legals on that are the same, which is very frustrating.
The cruise industry generally, I I'm told, has a reputation for good, accessible travel. But obviously, there's instances there with that case where it's gone wrong. But I know that Royal Caribbean has won awards for accessibility. The excursions they advertise, they have specific accessible versions of their excursions. And I spoke at the ABTA accessible travel seminar. ABTA are the Association of British Travel Agents just the other week. And again, it was a sold out event by industry. So a lot of recognition by players of outbound operators as well on the importance of getting this right. Great case studies from Jet2 and TUI for the brilliant work they're doing on accessible holidays. So yeah, I hear you that there's no excuse for that incident that's happened there, but we can draw some encouragement from operators really getting into the room and engaged on this topic. We just all wish it could move quicker than it does, right?
Yeah, and it comes back to the same point that nobody wants to provide. Nobody wants anybody to have a bad experience.
We're in the market of making memories. That's what the travel and tourism industry is about. Well, that's what it is, isn't it? If you get your job right in this industry, you've made memories for your guests and your visitors. So yeah, we are an industry that puts the person first, and we absolutely need to understand that everyone's needs are individual, and sometimes those needs are related to accessibility, and we need to listen, learn, and just continue to try and provide the best experiences for all of our guests and visitors, really.
I want Ross's job. Lawyers are not. Nobody's ever said lawyers are in the business of making memories, not in a good way, anyway.
No, you don't want my job, Chris.
Well, occasionally.
All right, guys. I think we'll draw things to a bit of a close. I think what's come through, and I'm going to be using this term, disability inclusion jigsaw puzzle a lot. I think that there are just so many different parts in the world becoming more and more accessible, and I think there's almost something, Katie, when you were both talking at the end, there's a sort of the pull factor that comes from the brand economic, making memories, sentiments, and there's a push factor, which is where we have to have legal structures and accountability and holding different, brands and organizations to accountability. And I think we're always going to need both. And it's important that we acknowledge both of those through today, the lens of accessible tourism, and in future episodes we'll be focusing on other topics. So I think it is both. And as we say, the overall purpose is about that the world doesn't have barriers and people with a disability can go wherever they want to and do what they want to do on that individual level. Is there anything either of you burning to say as a final word? Or are you happy with close?
No, good, thanks. Next time I'll make sure the cat's painted purple.
Yeah, that'd be good.
And I won't send my dog to daycare so that she can make an appearance next time.
Cool. And everyone watching and listening, I think as we said earlier, it's that, big thanks to Ross for joining for our focus on tourism and having just a really interesting conversation about so many areas. I think we could have doubled, tripled the time and still not covered all that's under tourism, but we did a good job. And I think, as we said with Chris, I think there's a nice synergy between us with our different backgrounds and experiences, and obviously the questions, particularly around rights and legislation and compliance. Just get your questions in if you have things you'd like Chris to help you with, and we'll try to get to those. And I guess it wouldn't be a podcast without saying please subscribe and like and share on whatever channel you're watching and listening. And that wraps up our inaugural episode of the Purple Collective podcast. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much. See you guys.
Thanks for having me, guys.